Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 25 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Ottawa Senators and lost by a score of 4-3. The Sharks are in the middle of a playoff drought. They haven't made it to the postseason since 2019, meaning they haven't made the playoffs in 5 years, and they are en route to missing for a 6th straight season if things go as they are expected to. As such, there haven't really been a lot of good games during that time period because of it. A few sprinkled in here or there for sure, but mostly just underwhelming performances. In fact, if we shine a spotlight onto last season in particular, it was almost entirely terrible outings night in, night out, even in the games that they actually ended up winning. Now, of course, I don't remember literally every single game that the Sharks have played over the last 5+ seasons, but I am still pretty confident in saying that this game here tonight against the Ottawa Senators was the Sharks' best game that they have played since 2019. And you might be sitting there and thinking, wait a minute, didn't the Sharks lose here tonight in regulation? And that is indeed the case, but sometimes that's just how things go in the NHL. Over a full 82-game season, sometimes the hockey gods simply just are not in your corner, and you can do everything right and still end up on the losing side of things. I don't think there's a single Sharks fan, or perhaps even a single Ottawa Senators fan, who can sit there with a straight face and say that the Sharks did not deserve the win here tonight. They were dominant from minute 1 to minute 60. They were the better team, and it's just unfortunate for them that they end up coming out on the losing side of things. It starts off in the first period. It was actually Ottawa who strikes not just first, but also second as well. A goal from Gaudette makes it 1-0, and then former Sharks draft pick Josh Norris makes it 2-0 on the power play, and the Sharks find themselves in a hole early. But that doesn't mean that the first period was poorly played. As I said, minute 1 to minute 60 dominance. The Senators only had 4 shots in these opening 20. The Sharks otherwise were mostly controlling this game. It's just, unfortunately, they found themselves in that 2-0 hole. But they did not give up, as we know from this Sharks team this year, and they would cut the lead in half with Ferraro's first of the season to make it 2-1. But then it would be Cleven's, his first career goal, who would make it 3-1 Ottawa at the end of 40 minutes. Going into the third, though, the Sharks, they knew that they could come back in this one. They had been playing so well, and in the third, they raised that level even more, and they get 2 goals from both of their teenagers. It is Celebrini and then Smith on the power play, who tie this one up at 3. But it seemed as though a victory was not in the cards no matter what the Sharks did, and it is Gaudette who ends up with the game winner with just a few minutes left on the clock, and the Sharks can't tie it up again. They lose it 4-3. But to just put into perspective how dominant the Sharks looked here tonight, this Cleven's goal that made it 3-1 was the Senators' 10th shot of the game. The Gaudette game winner that came over 20 minutes later was the Senators' 11th shot of the game, meaning they went an entire period of play, over 20 minutes of play, without so much as sniffing the net. That's how good San Jose looked, how much they shut down the Ottawa's play, and yet it's a loss anyhow. And of course, coming into this season, we talked about how we're not coming in expecting many more victories. The Sharks will likely still find themselves near the bottom of the standings, but what we would hope for is that the Sharks in their losses could look a lot more competitive. And so in games this season, like against the Rangers, where they lost 3-2, or against the Dallas Stars, where they lost in the shootout, the general messaging at the end of it was, well, at least we played a close game, at least we looked pretty good against a good hockey team, so you can't be too disappointed with how things go, especially since at the end of the day, you're maybe hoping for a really good draft position for the Sharks by the end of this season. However, this game, that messaging is different. At least when I speak for myself here, this was a frustrating one to lose. It was one that I was really hoping that the Sharks would be able to pull out, because they absolutely deserved it. The players here absolutely deserved to head back to the locker room with smiles on their faces so the coach could come in and really pat them all on the back and say, we played a full 60 minutes, a great team game, we all looked fantastic. And yet instead, they're now heading back to the dressing room, their heads are hanging low, and they're thinking, what more could we have possibly done here tonight? Because this was a full 60-minute effort for the Sharks. A few games ago, the Sharks played against the Detroit Red Wings, and we talked about how that was the first full 60-minute effort for the Sharks this season. This game tonight against the Senators makes that one look like the worst game of the year. That's just how good San Jose looked, which is something I've repeated already multiple times, but it is definitely, in my opinion now, the most disappointing game of the season. Not because the Sharks didn't play well, obviously, but simply because they didn't get the result that they wanted and they really should have gotten. Moving on to the players to talk about, in games past, and in particular last year, there were many reviews that I did where it really wasn't worth talking about the players because the Sharks got absolutely blown out, that pretty much every single player was just at a baseline below average, if not just really bad, like a couple of those 10-goal losses that the Sharks had. There was nothing really to be said. This type of game is sort of the opposite. Obviously, I'll still talk about the players because when it is a good game, it's very fun to do so, but it is a situation where pretty much every single one of these players was at the very least good, if not just really, really great. And we start off with the Sharks top line. It is again Celebrini with Eklund and Zetterlund because for the second straight game, Granlund misses out. And interestingly enough, these have been two of the better games for the Sharks this season. That Kings game in which they explode 5 goals in the third period, and then here tonight I've already talked about it at length, how it's the best game the Sharks have played in a long time. I'm not going to say it is because of Granlund's absence, but of course many people were worried how the Sharks would look if that player were to be traded away at some point this season. And while this is still a very small sample size, there's no telling that if Granlund were to be injured long term or to be traded away, if the Sharks could keep this type of performance up over an extended period of time. But it is good news that is not, the sky doesn't fall if Granlund happens to not be in the lineup. When it comes to this top line, as I said, I had mentioned in that Kings game that they weren't fully in sync yet, but they looked a lot better here tonight. They were far and away, in my opinion, the Sharks' most effective line. Maybe they didn't have the most zone time, but when it came to actual chances, they were all over it here tonight. Macklin, Celebrini, what more could possibly be said about this player? All of the plays that you expect from him, he was still able to do here tonight, and all of the plays that you don't even expect him to pull out, he still ended up actually doing. This was an incredible game for him, and he had to step up in a big way, and Warsofsky made sure he did that. The ice time here tonight was genuinely absurd for this top line, but for Celebrini in particular. 25 and a half minutes of ice time for a forward is like unheard of outside of the playoffs, where you can have like really extended overtimes. This is pretty much something that you really never see. Most defensemen these days don't even hit up at 25 and a half minutes, and yet Celebrini, as an 18-year-old, his 13th game of the season, is putting up a number like that and still looking as good as he did. He scores that goal, an important one for the Sharks to help get them back on track there in that third period. So there's really not much else to be said. One thing that I will point out on the Clevens goal, this was a mistake a bit by Celebrini, a little bit out of position. Clevens was someone he probably could have been covering, so it's not a pristine, perfect game, but it's just about as good as you could hope for from your 18-year-old. He just continues to be so impressive. But I also was really much a fan of William Eklund here tonight. I talked about over these last 3 games that he seemed a little bit off. He wasn't fully kind of in the game. It felt as though many of his plays were falling just a bit short. Here tonight, that was clearly not a problem for him. He had great chemistry with Celebrini. They were playing back and forth between each other exceptionally well. He had a great pass on that Celebrini goal. Eklund also by far one of the Sharks' best players, and he also ended up with mega minutes here tonight, over 24 minutes of ice time as well. The third player on this line was Fabian Zetterlund, and I will say, at the very least, Zetterlund was still quite good. The thing that was kind of exposed in a way for Fabian Zetterlund is that both Celebrini and Eklund, though I guess maybe more of an emphasis on Celebrini, are exceptionally skilled and talented players when it comes to the puck, and they're able to move it around so well in the offensive zone, and Zetterlund, not so much the case. So he's like a good fill-in type of player. He's someone who can complement those two, but there were definitely a few plays here tonight where it felt as though he was just a step or two behind, and that if he was maybe a slightly better player, things could have worked out better and they probably could have had at least another goal or 2 more. And so this is not really a fault of Zetterlund, because you can't just say like, oh, if he was only a better player, that's kind of a weird criticism to have, but it's a situation that exists nonetheless. So I do enjoy Zetterlund as a player, but it is quite clear, and we've already known this, but just to reiterate it, it is quite clear that in the long term, while Zetterlund will definitely remain with the team and be a very useful asset, he's very much not like a first line forward that you really project out. Celebrini is, Eklund very well might be, but Zetterlund, not so much. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Cunnin, Wenberg, and Toffoli. This wasn't a line that had like immense amount of chances. It's not as though they had like the first line where they were just zone time after zone time, offensive shift after offensive shift, but they had some good looks. I'll actually start off with Luke Cunnin, who once again I thought looked like pretty good here tonight. It wasn't spectacular, but it was solid. He had some good looks. He had a great chance, not out of the box because he wasn't the one who took the penalty, but he got the breakaway right after it expired at the beginning of the second period, which kind of started the onslaught once more for the Sharks and eventually led to that Mario Ferraro goal. So you like that from him. He had a few other really good looks on net, so he continues to be an effective player for now on the Sharks' second line. When it comes to his other winger, Tyler Toffoli, he had a couple of decent chances. He did hit a post here tonight, so he came very close to actually managing to score, but I did actually feel he was perhaps like one of the least effective players for the Sharks. As I said though earlier on, at a baseline, everyone was at least pretty good, and Toffoli is a part of that, but I would have liked to see, with all the open ice that the Senators were giving the Sharks, Toffoli to have done a little bit more. And then when it comes to Alex Wenberg, continues to be able to put up like some pretty solid performances, and tonight was no different, doing those little things pretty well and generally looking solid. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Sturm, Smith, and Goodrow, the same third line that the Sharks had last game, but we got to see a very interesting experiment here tonight because of what happened early on. Goodrow plays a shift, maybe a couple of shifts, and then he leaves with injury. Only 2 minutes of ice time here, so he leaves quite early on. And so this is the first game in a long time where Will Smith is not on a line with Barclay Goodrow for the majority of it. This very rarely has happened. Even when Smith was paired with Celebrini, they always had Goodrow on that line with them, and it felt as though the training weights were finally taking off. That you don't need to ride your little training reel bike at the age of 5 years old. Now he gets to ride a big boy bike, and suddenly Smith looked unleashed here tonight. By far his best game of the season. You know, it's not Macklin Celebrini level, and I don't think it ever will be, but the things that Smith does well as a player were on full display in this one. That great no-look pass once again, something that we have become used to when Smith is given this time and space, is that he's able to have those great passes that really just freeze defensemen. Ferraro, a player who is not usually offensively gifted, gets his first goal of the season pretty much gift wrapped for him as we're approaching Thanksgiving here. And so then he also manages to get this goal. It's on the power play, so you're thinking, well, there's a bit more space to work with as well. But this wasn't just he plants himself in one area and takes a shot that goes in, but it was some hard work, some good skating from him to get behind the defense and make a nice move on net. Requires a little bit of a lucky bounce, but a deserved one at that. Great game for Will Smith, and I wonder if Warsofsky, standing from the bench, looks at this and says, hey, Smith actually looks good and unleashed a bit without Barclay Goodrow in this line. Who could have possibly seen that coming? And if Goodrow isn't out long term and he's back within the next couple of games, if perhaps the Sharks are actually willing to finally separate those two players. Because on his line with him here tonight throughout was Nico Sturm, who also brings a bit of a defensive aspect to this game. He also has that ability to cover for potential mistakes that Smith will make. But while Goodrow has zero offensive talent, at least Sturm is a bit involved and has the potential to actually score goals or put up points, something that Goodrow really rarely can actually have been said for thus far this season, even though he's played with some of the Sharks' best players at times this year. And so Sturm, I thought he had a really good game. He was a pretty solid complement to Will Smith, and they were tied together most of the time, at the very least, by Klim Kostin. Now, Kostin had a very Kostin game, which means that there were a lot of high highs here. He had a great pass to Will Smith that led to this no-look pass for Mario Ferraro, so that was nice to see. And he generally actually made some good chemistry with Will Smith, plays an interesting position on that line in the sense that he's that big-bodied forward who can, like with Barclay Goodrow, at least the thought was for Barclay Goodrow, create space on the ice for Smith. And since Kostin actually has, the slightest amount of offensive talent, it can actually work better. But then we also see the reasonings for why this wasn't tried earlier, which is that Kostin remains an untrustworthy player. We see him right at the end of this third period. It's on this Gaudette goal shift, though it's not directly because of Kostin necessarily. He tries to do too much as he has at times done this season. He stick handling in front of the net, he gets punished. It's a giveaway. The Senators end up hitting the post on this one, but as I said, it creates that scramble in the Sharks defense, and eventually it is Gaudette who does pick up the goal. And so you can't have one of your players in a tie game in front of the net with 4 minutes left make a giveaway like that. It's just frankly unacceptable. But it's also the lack of discipline, as Kostin adds yet another minor penalty here. It's only got 5, and you might be thinking 5 minor penalties isn't the end of the world. I mean, Goodrow's got 8 of them on the season, but the thing is, it's important to recall that Kostin has only played about half the year at this point. If you actually take a look at his particular stat, which is penalty minutes as a percentage of ice time, far and away the leader on the Sharks is Giovanni Smith, but that's a little bit disingenuous because both of his penalties have been majors, fighting majors. That's his 10 penalty minutes, and that is not really something that hurts the team all that much. If you take a look at just minor penalties, Kostin leads the Sharks by a pretty significant margin. He needs to be more disciplined if he wants to be trusted. He needs to be making also just more disciplined with his puck management if he wants to be trusted, because he could be a great option on the third line with Will Smith once the Sharks actually get healthy, or even if the Sharks wanted to go for something like Smith, Celebrini, and Kostin, that could be a decent option on paper, but Kostin doesn't have that defensive reliability to actually be looked at as a serious contender for that role. When it comes to the other couple of players here on the Sharks' fourth line, probably the least effective ones of the game for the Sharks tonight, Grundstrom and Dellandrea. As I said, baseline pretty good, but not really much else to say. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we have the Sharks' top defender, Jake Walman, where it was once again, like I said with Kostin being a Kostin game, it was a Walman type of game. A Walman gives and Walman takes as well. In the first period on both of these goals, I did not like the effort that Walman put up. The first one here, it's not so much his fault, but it is kind of a pet peeve of mine, and it's something that as Sharks fans we've had to deal with for so many years when Brent Burns was here, is players laying down on the ice to try and block a shot or block a pass. This can be sometimes a good choice in a few select situations, but a lot of the times what this simply just does is take you out of the play completely, and any skilled player in the NHL, like I believe Tim Stützle for the Ottawa Senators is, and that is exactly who is holding the puck in this situation, that is anything that a good player is going to be able to abuse, and that's what happens on this first goal. Walman takes himself out of the play, which allows for this easy pass in front and the goal, but that's not really the major mistake. The major mistake happens on the second one. The Sharks are short-handed, and this is a high puck battle, 50-50, and Walman from deep in the, or relatively deep in the zone, busts out to cheat offensively for a shorthanded opportunity. This isn't like a 90-10 puck battle where it's quite obvious the Sharks are going to win it. This is like a 50-50. This could go either way. And it's one thing if you're the forward who makes a play like this, but if you're the defenseman, you're the last line of defense, and you're trying to skate out of the zone for a shorthanded chance, you're 4-on-5 and you're doing that, that just simply cannot be happening in this situation. And the Sharks get burned because of this. Walman can't get back in time, and it's an easy pass in front for Norris, who's all alone to score this goal. So there are major mistakes still in Walman's game, but at the same time, there is some great offensive plays as well. In the early third period, we saw Walman go after a loose puck at the or near the blue line. This is a play that I don't think any other defenseman on the Sharks currently would be making. Ruda, Thrun, Ferraro, all of them would have played it safe, hung back in the neutral zone, but Walman goes for it because he thinks he has the skating ability and the stick positioning to do so, and it works out, and it keeps the puck alive in the offensive zone for San Jose to get more zone time, to get more chances on net. That's the value that Walman can bring, but it also shows the riskiness of a player that he has. So it's kind of like the comparison I've drawn so many times to Erik Karlsson. You take the good with the bad, and you just kind of have to hope that in most games that you roll more good than you do bad. When it comes to his defensive partner, Cody Ceci, kind of like with Dellandrea and Grundstrom, there isn't really a lot to be said about Ceci here tonight. He was all right, but maybe, clearly not the Sharks' best defenseman. That title would actually come to a player on the second defensive pairing. Now, you would think saying that I must be talking about Timothy Liljegren, because I couldn't possibly be talking about the other player here, but in fact I am. It is Mario Ferraro. Ferraro has been getting a lot better as of late. There was one bad game, I think it was against Buffalo, if I'm not mistaken, but the 3 of his last 4 games prior to this one, he's actually been pretty good, and here tonight, he raised the stakes insanely. He was clearly the Sharks' best defenseman. Solid defensive plays, but incredibly impressive offensive plays as well. Ferraro had the space, and he was actually able to make something out of it. And it's not really the goal that he scored. That's nice to see, but as I said, pretty much gift-wrapped to him by Will Smith. Mark-Edouard Vlasic could have scored an orange cone, basically, could have scored that goal, but it was really the other plays that Ferraro was making that actually left me very, very impressed, which is a good thing, of course, because if you are on the trade Mario Ferraro train, you need to see him raise that level of play to actually keep his trade value at like a decent position. But if you are someone who just wants to see Ferraro play good hockey, which is something that we have not seen for most of this season, it is also a good sign that he has been getting better as of late. Maybe that is going to lead to even better things in the future. When it comes to his defensive partner, Timothy Liljegren, a couple of steps behind Ferraro, which is not something I usually expect to say coming into these reviews, but it was indeed the case here tonight. But I still thought Liljegren was all right. You could certainly argue his effort on that Gaudette goal. Could he have maybe tied up the stick a little bit better? Perhaps. But as I said, we're kind of splitting hairs here a bit. The Sharks made mistakes tonight. There's never going to be a game by any team in the entire league, even the best of the best, who are going to go an entire game without making any sort of mistakes whatsoever. It's simply about cleaning up those mistakes. It's simply about relying on your goaltender to make the saves on those mistakes. And so, yeah, could Liljegren have maybe made a better play here? For sure, but I thought the good outweighed the bad. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we have Thrun and Ruda. There wasn't a lot of excitement from this third defensive pairing, but at least it was quite good. Jan Ruda continues to be a solid third pairing defenseman for the Sharks after having to watch him agonizingly go through those first 15 or so games of the season as being like the worst second pairing defenseman in the history of the NHL. But here he's actually found a home and actually been pretty good. When it comes to his defensive partner, Henry Thrun, I also thought Thrun was rather solid. Some good puck battles won. Obviously, you look at this Clevens goal and you say, did Thrun give away this puck? On watching it multiple times, it's honestly kind of hard to tell, at least from the angles that I saw. I don't know if it's Thrun who's making this pass, but instead it seems as though he might have just lost the battle and it is the Senators player making this pass. Either way, Celebrini's a little bit out of position, as I mentioned, and of course the goaltender, the last line of defense, just does not come through here. So I'm not going to put a ton of blame onto Henry Thrun. I still thought it was a pretty good game. And that does bring us to the Sharks goaltender, Mackenzie Blackwood. If there is one player who stands out above the rest as having actually not had a good night, that is very much clearly Blackwood. Obviously, Blackwood has come up huge for the Sharks thus far this season, so this isn't a situation where you're thinking, yet again, it is Blackwood who completely blows it for the Sharks. He's had some great games. You know, that game a couple of weeks ago against the New Jersey Devils was almost entirely won off the backs of Blackwood just stealing it from New Jersey. But we still have to say, you know, call a spade here. Blackwood was a major, if not the major reason the Sharks did lose. Yeah, you maybe can't blame him for most of these goals. The Clevens one clearly is one he should absolutely have, bar none, every single time. But, you know, the Norris one's a tough one. Both Gaudette goals are also relatively tough. But at the same time, you give up 4 goals on 11 shots, and then you look on the other side of the ice, Linus Ullmark for the Senators, who's making like 30 insanely great saves here tonight, keeping the Senators alive and stealing them the 2 points here. You can't help but be disappointed with how badly your goaltender won the goaltending battle here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday. They'll be taking on the Seattle Kraken, the final game of this 4-game homestand, and hopefully the San Jose Sharks can carry in through the massive momentum generated here tonight and actually translate that into a victory that they so much deserved. Class dismissed.